Good evening, everybody, and welcome to BrisScience for November 2021. We are back here in person at the Edge at the State Library of Queensland. It is very exciting to be back and to see so many of you out here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. If this is your first BrisScience, fantastic, welcome. BrisScience is a series of free public lectures on science presented by the University of Queensland. And the aim is to bring not just the best scientists, but also the best communicators to share their research with Brisbane and indeed with the rest of the world, because we are also live streaming out tonight as well. And these talks will end up on YouTube later. So hi to all of our viewers at home. BrisScience, as I said, is hosted by the University of Queensland. My name is Joel Gilmore. I'll be your MC for this evening. And I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting tonight and pay my respects to elders, both past and present. For tonight's talk, because we are in a mixed, we're here and also online, we're going to be taking questions over the web. So we have a software platform there, bit.ly/BrisSciQA, I think is the numbers off the top of my head. If you haven't already grabbed that, we will put it up again after the talk as well. There we go. It is case sensitive. So pop that in, and throughout the talk, you can add your questions to that list, and we'll go through as many of those as we can at the end of the evening. But if you do have your phones here tonight, if you could now pop them on silent, that would be amazing. Also, just a reminder, we are here live, so please make sure you're all wearing pants from now on. So for tonight's talk, we are talking about fossils. And no, I'm not talking about the ones attending the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow. And I'm not even talking about dinosaurs. I'm actually talking about dinosaurs' much cooler relatives, the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles that once ruled the skies, including right here in Australia. And as we'll hear tonight, where the world's largest known pterosaur was recently discovered. Joining us tonight to talk about this is Tim Richards from UQ's Dinosaur Lab, who led the research team that analysed a fossilised jaw discovered in Wonnamara country near Richmond here in Queensland. And Tim is a PhD candidate at UQ and an expert in genetics and paleobiology. And tonight he's going to give us the inside scoop on this discovery and this amazing creature. So for the talk you've been waiting about 104 million years for, please welcome Tim Richards.
Thank you, Joel. Cheers. Welcome. Before I start, I too would like to make an acknowledgement to country and just acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the land upon which we meet tonight, and also the Wonnamara Nation and their custodianship of the land upon which our research was conducted. Pay respects to ancestors and descendants, and recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Okay, so pterosaurs. Right, so normally people just skip past their opening, their title slide, and just there's something there to fill in the time while you guys are coming in. But look, I just want to make note of something. So fearsome, flying, and forgotten. Some beautiful alliteration going on to describe our pterosaurs. Now, if I was to describe researching pterosaurs, there's probably some other F words that I'd use, given the paucity of Australia's pterosaur record, or fossil record. And that would be obviously frustrating and fruitful. What do you think I was going to say? So, anyway, we're here to talk about pterosaurs. Now, I'm warning you now that there will be some audience participation. There has to be in any talk. I'm all for it. If I'm up here suffering, so are you. But no. And there will also be an exam at the end of tonight's talk as well. So please listen up. If I see anyone nodding off, I'll know you'll be getting an F for pterosaur. Anyway, first thing I want to point out tonight is the title slide here. So, as Joel has kindly sort of introduced me, I'm from the University of Queensland, and I'm also attached to their Dinosaur Lab. Now, what's the first thing you'll notice? We're not talking about dinosaurs tonight. I've tried to petition my supervisors so many times to change the name of that lab, but it's not going to happen. Anyway, this is what I want to start the talk off with, and that is by debunking a couple of pterosaur myths, a bit of pterosaur misinformation, as it were. And the first one I want to speak about is the fact that pterosaurs are just flying dinosaurs. The second one I'd like to cover and debunk tonight is the fact that all pterosaurs are simply maybe referred to as pterodactyls, and we'll get to that one a bit later on. So as I said, there will be an exam, but pay attention. Okay, so pterosaurs are flying dinosaurs. Where do we get that from? Well, from an early age, we're taught D is for dinosaur, and a little picture there of what is not a dinosaur, but in fact a blue pterosaur. The one below it is your orange T-Rex, yes, dinosaur, but above it, no. Then we go on to sort of websites that are devoted to sort of educational websites, and again, we find a title that says Flying Dinosaur. But it's not just kids' books or educational websites that make this mistake. It also happens in some sort of reputable media organisations as well. Now, the one on the left is not actually my research. It was some from another university and another pterosaur, but you'll see it describes it as a giant flying dinosaur. And the one on the right is actually from our our latest paper that just came out. And again, it's referred to as a giant flying dinosaur. Unfortunately, that is incorrect. Pterosaurs are not dinosaurs, and I'll explain why. So, if we look at a family tree of archosaurs, which basically includes crocodiles, dinosaurs, and pterosaurs, and some weird little sort of dinosauromorphs in the middle, which we won't be referring to, but essentially they're all archosaurs. So far, so good. We take the next step up to Ave metatarsalia, and that just basically says we now get rid of the crocodiles, and they are no longer part of our group. But pterosaurs and dinosaurs are, and they're joined basically because they have a common ankle bone, essentially. That's what that's saying. But you will notice that pterosaurs are over there, whilst dinosaurs are over here. So what makes the two different? Well, like most good dances, the rumba, the tango, it's all about the hips. So dinosaurs have three major bones to their pelvises, okay, their pelves. They have, in the middle, where the three join, a gaping hole where the femur head, so the top bone, the leg bone, where the femoral head will fit in. Now, in dinosaurs, they have this gap, as you can see. And whereas pterosaurs don't. They have this nice little sort of ball and socket joint, like we do, but they don't have this gap. And that is one of the major differences between dinosaurs and pterosaurs, apart from the fact, of course, that pterosaurs could fly. So let's talk a little bit about that. Flying dinosaurs. Just have a look at this scenario and tell me, what do you think the outcome of this may be? Splat. Well, in paleontology, we have a term for this, and it's basically terminal velociraptor. Yes, so as you can see, the old velociraptor jumps off a cliff, and it's not going anywhere but straight down. Now, of course, some dinosaurs made an attempt at flying, and this guy here, Yi Chi from China, he has this kind of really nice sort of membranous wings, almost like a bat. He has these elongated third finger, and that's important because I'll come back to that later on. And he also has this other bone here, which is not technically a finger, but some sort of outgrowth from the wrist. But they had an attempt at flying, but recent sort of research suggests that the whole proportions of the weight with Yi Chi here were probably not in the range of being able to glide that well. But we do know that dinosaurs eventually did work it out, and they could fly. We just don't call them dinosaurs anymore. We call them birds, okay? And these guys came from the theropod lineage, which is one of the sort of T-Rexy kind of pterosaurs, and they evolved, or they adapted their feathers, which they already had as dinosaurs, into flight feathers, and nowadays we have over 10,000 species of flying dinosaurs. Some of them are in fact are so popular that they become official. And if you have a look at our national emblem on the left and the Queensland emblem on the right, you'll notice that they too have flying dinosaurs. although I know the emu can't fly, that's another adaptation. They sort of went, nah, let's not go there, and let's grow some nice legs instead. So, little revision, pterosaurs, please, are not dinosaurs, okay? The next myth I want to say is pterodactyls are pterosaurs and the two terms are interchangeable. Well, no, not really. But why did we get to this stage? My father still calls them pterodactyls. A lot of people do, but I want to explain why not all pterosaurs are pterodactyls. It all starts with this bad boy here from the Solnhofen Formation in Germany. This is a sort of a late Jurassic fossil, so about 150 million years old. And it was discovered in the late sort of 1700s, and it was handed to this fella here, Cosimo Collini, in 1784. And he had the task of trying to describe this. Now, what's cool about this, just to sidetrack and waffle a little bit, is that not only did this sort of introduce pterosaurs to the world, but it also led scientists to start to ponder about a topic which no one had really sort of thought about before, and that is extinction. Up until then, people didn't think that these fossils belonged to animals that no longer existed. But Collini kind of changed that argument and said, well, this thing looks so unlike anything living today that perhaps these animals no longer exist. So what did Collini come up with? Well, he came up with an extinct marine creature. And look, you can't blame him for it. The long finger, yeah, it looks like a flipper. And in fact, if you sort of put a little shell or a carapace on the top of that, it could be a weird-looking turtle. But that was his guess. And basically, pterosaurs went through a lot of iterations in between before they were actually called pterosaurs. So some of these guys here point out the large sort of the Mickey Mouse-shaped kind of wings. They were thought of as mammals. They also kindly put some external genitalia on them, okay, thinking they were mammals. It's lovely. Or they were sort of thought of as these bat-like creatures as well. And it wasn't until we get to this gentleman here, Cuvier, and he was a naturalist, French naturalist in the early 1800s, and he sort of had another attempt at describing this fossil from Germany. And that is his illustration that he made. And you will notice there that he calls it a reptile volant, meaning a flying reptile. He was the first one to recognize that what we're looking at here is actually reptilian in nature for a whole host of reasons, which I won't go into right now. But he was the first one to realize that, yes, perhaps this is related to, it comes from the Reptilia clade. And this was back in 1801. And so the name of this guy he gave was Pterodactylus antiquus. And hence, Pterodactylus was born, and so was pterosaurs for that matter. So up until then, obviously, we didn't know. Pterosaurs still wasn't a term. It was just everything in this sort of that looked like this kind of guys were named Pterodactylus. And that stuck for the next 200 odd years. And so if we go into the family tree, and this is kind of an up-to-date sort of, version of where we're at with all pterosaurs, you will notice that Pterodactylus is but one genus of a lot of different pterosaurs, okay? So that is the difference. Yes, all pterodactyls are pterosaurs, but not all pterosaurs are pterodactyls, okay? And remember the exam. So next time you see a puzzle that looks something like this, it's technically incorrect. It's not a pterodactyl floor puzzle. Technically, it should be called a pterosaur floor puzzle, or more correctly, pteranodon floor puzzle. So, what makes a pterosaur a pterosaur? I've been telling you what it's not. I'd like to now sort of point out and tell you what actually makes a pterosaur a pterosaur. So let's bring up this guy here, and this is a complete fossil. The dark sort of black regions are the actual real fossils that we have. The rest of it's kind of an interpretation, but it illustrates my point. So the first thing that pterosaurs have is a very elongated fourth manual digit, which is just a fancy word for a finger. So they have this really, really massive fourth digit. So imagine having a whole wing coming off your ring finger. The other thing they have, of course, is they have a large skull relative to the torso length, okay? And all pterosaurs have this in common. They also have, and they're unique in this, is they have on each wrist, they have what's called a pteroid bone. Now, if you imagine a wing coming the front, the propatigium, which is what we call it, but basically they are kind of like little lifters on an aeroplane. So the pteroid, we think, was involved in keeping that taut, okay, coming into land, slowing down, things like that. The other thing they had was extremely thin bones, okay, and I'm talking about the sort of the cortex bone that runs around the outside of your bone. So this is purely a flight adaptation, obviously, to make things lighter, but keep it structurally secure. And it did that by reducing the actual thickness of the bone, but the trabeculae, or those little kind of bony struts in there, they give a lot of support for very, very little weight, okay? So that is what makes pterosaurs pterosaurs. So, you've all come here tonight to talk about Australian pterosaurs, okay? So, this is the audience participation time. Someone name an Australian pterosaur. Tabonaga. Thank you, Yorgo, who also is a lab partner of mine in the Dino Lab. Okay, nice work. Everyone but Yorgo, name another Australian pterosaur. There's a reason for that. Okay, I need to give you a brief history of Australian pterosaurs, and when I present this sort of slide at conferences, I normally get sort of crude remarks from other pterosaurologists around the world and going, oh, this won't take long, and they're right, it's all done in one slide. So, pterosaur fossil localities, let's go through. So the majority of Australian pterosaurs come from central west Queensland, from a loose kind of area that includes Richmond, Boulia, Hughenden, but they're all connected because they're all found in the same sort of rock, which is the Toolabuck Formation. The next one is Dinosaur Cove. We have a couple of specimens from down in Victoria that have been described. The next one is from the Winton Formation, so this is obviously in Winton. We do have, and this is a very nice one, and you'll see this specimen a bit later on. And then we have two teeth that have been described from Lightning Ridge. We have a ulna from near Carnarvon that's been described. And we also have a very, very partial fragmented jaw from the Miria Formation in, the Molecap Greensand in Perth. And all up, we have 20 described pterosaur specimens. That is it. Hence my words, my F words that I used at the start. So, let's put everything into context. We've got roughly 20 described specimens, okay? Compare that with described Australian dinosaur specimens. We've got well and truly over 1,000 specimens of dinosaur, okay? We have 4 named Australian pterosaur species. In context, worldwide, there's roughly around about 150 pterosaurs named worldwide, which basically means that we sort of can lay claim to about 2.7% of known worldwide dinosaurs. That's not much. Why? So why so few dinosaurs? Well, the first thing you've got to realise is that obviously with most pterosaurs fossils, and also really most fossils, they are exceptionally rare, okay? So the whole process that a bone needs to go through in order to be fossilised and then found millions of years later, you know, is very, very delicate. And we don't often find most of the things that lived before, okay? The other thing, of course, is that because of the nature, and I explained how light boned they were, it also means that quite often they're fragmentary pieces, all but one pterosaur, they're completely isolated pieces, so we don't even have 2 pieces from the same individual, except for one. And that makes it extremely hard, therefore, to diagnose. So most of this gets chucked in the too hard basket by paleontologists, and they won't go near them because they're just little chunks, ugly bits of rock that you cannot do anything with. The other thing, of course, is there's inherent biases in the fossil record, so sampling biases, of course, where do we actually look for these things? And there's also preservational biases, which are related to the fact that these things are exceptionally rare, and also they don't fossilise that well. Okay, so that's why pterosaurs are so few. Let's go through them. So this is Mythunga camara, and this was Australia's first named pterosaur. It comes from the Hughenden region in central Queensland, also from the Toolabuck Formation. Now, when this guy was described, you can see here we're looking at basically the mid part of a skull. That is the top jaw, that is the bottom jaw down there, and it's got some very fearsome looking teeth involved. But this guy, in terms of sort of finding out where it sat in the big family tree of pterosaurs, went back and forth for years, and it wasn't really until about 2 years ago that the debate was actually settled. And it stems from this. Right at the front here, there are two teeth that are pretty close together. And for years, because of that, we assumed that they were the two front teeth of the lower jaw, and therefore the snout would have ended around about here, which would have made this a really, really weird-looking pterosaur, very short-snouted, yet really, really robust. So it kind of got thrown into this basket called Archaeopterodactyloid, which just means it looks like a pterodactyloid, which is one of the more recent clades of pterosaurs, one of the more modern clades. But because it's got this short snout and a couple of other features, we're going to say it was probably one of the first ones of these new pterosaurs to appear, hence the archaeo bit on that title, meaning old. So that's where it kind of stayed. But then there was papers that came out for the next sort of 20 years, or 15 years, saying, we're not sure though, possibly that's not where the snout ends and we're just reading it incorrectly. And a really nice paper came out in 2019, which basically showed, using CT scans, that the two teeth that were at the front here that were assumed to be, the left and right sort of mandibular teeth, were actually, what we were seeing was one primary tooth and a replacement tooth from the same side close together. So that was really great because of what it meant. It freed us up and we could now extend this snout to what it actually probably would have looked like given the robust nature of everything else. It just didn't look, it looked weird by ending the snout there. Anyway, so that's my Thunga, the first one. It's kind of like the holy grail of pterosaurs. This was a Nature paper, if that means anything to you guys. So it was, it was a real big deal back in the day. The second pterosaur to be named was called Aussie Draco Molnaro. And I'll say that again, Aussie, oi, 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 Draco. So, and I've noticed here, it's got this groove going here. Okay, that is what we call just simply a mandibular groove, or basically this nice groove that was in the bottom jaw. So what you're looking at here is essentially just the fragment, the anterior portion of a lower jaw, okay? But it's got this really, really deep groove here, which was sort of not really seen in Australian pterosaurs until then. It also has, and if you look at the scale bar just for reference, it has teeth, or actually more correctly, tooth sockets or alveoli that are really close to one another. This thing is extremely, extremely thin. And I called it the odd one out, basically because everything else you're going to see tonight from Australia belongs in a family of pterosaurs that's called Anaguera. Okay, now the ins and outs of that's not really important, but what you need to know is that most of the Australian pterosaurs that we see are actually probably more closely related to taxa, or animals from South America and from Africa, than they are to this guy. So if we skip ahead, so what you'll notice here is that we're looking at the side of this same specimen. This is the bottom, and then this is the top with the teeth socket, okay? What you'll notice is that there is no gigantic crest here, which every Australian pterosaur has. This guy doesn't have it. It's relatively flat, and another really weird feature is that the dorsal surface of the lower jaw, this bit here, is actually convex. It has this kind of weird bend to it, which again, no other Australian pterosaur had as well. Hence the odd one out title. So where did this one end up in the big scheme of pterosaurs family? Well, recently it's been described and placed in the family of Targaryen Draconia. And for those of you that may be Game of Thrones fans, you'll know where this word comes from. So this is the dragon of the Targaryen family, okay? And again, I'd like to point out that no pterosaurs were harmed here. That is not a pterosaur. That is, in fact, a dragon, a fictional mythical beast. So that's Aussie Draco. Right, so the third one, this is our best pterosaur fossil, okay? This one was described a couple of years ago. It's called Pharaoh Draco, or the Iron Dragon. And this one hails from Winton. And basically, as I've written there, it's Australia's most complete pterosaur. As you can see here, it's got a really, really nice big sort of rostral crest on the upper jaw. The lower jaw is broken a little bit. Again, it's got these nice sort of fearsome looking teeth. And that's about as far back as we get in the skull, and then that was pretty much it. But what is cool about this guy is that we also, for the first time, from the same individual, have some postcranial material. So we've got a little bit of vertebrae here, a little bit of a scapula going on there, and then some phalanges and some wing elements and all that. And this all belongs to the same individual. So this is as good as it gets in terms of sort of complete material from Australia. Then we get to my little baby, or our little baby, and this is Tabonaga shawai. So this is the new one that we described only a few months ago. The paper was published, and as you can see, what are we looking at? Well, it's the bottom jaw. Again, there's the front, and there's the incomplete back where it's broken off, and there's a whole broken sort of edge there as well. But what you will notice is that it has this massive mandibular crest, okay? And when you compare this with pterosaurs from around the world, that crest is the biggest mandibular crest seen in any Anagueran pterosaur worldwide. Other features though, really cool ones, some teeth running around the side. That thing there, it confused me for a while. That's just a shell fragment. It's not a little bit of tooth, unfortunately. But that's the new guy. So welcome to Tabonaga shawai. But before we can get to that stage, of course, there's a few things that need to happen. That's the paper, sorry, that we published in. So before we get to this, we need to talk about where Tabonaga comes from, the discovery, and how it ends up in a paleontological journal. Okay, so this is before the journal, before we've measured things, and before it's actually even called Tabonaga. So let's go back to the early days of this fossil. And where are we talking? We're talking Richmond, okay, which again is in northwest Queensland. If you haven't been there, I really recommend you going. It's got a lovely museum up there. But this is where Tabonaga, or technically KKF 494, was found. And that's what I referred to it for about a year. So it was found there. If we zoom in there, you'll see that the township of Richmond is just here, and about 12 k's northwest of Richmond is the fossil site, and that fossil site is called Free Fossil Hunting Site number 1, and that's opposed to Free Fossil Hunting Site number 2. But what you'll notice here is some people digging, and a little pond here, and this rock here, this is where they're digging. This is the Toollabuk Formation. And for those of you sort of with a geological bent, we're talking about a sequence of rocks that is interspersed with limestones and shales and sort of oil shales and things like that. So really, really cool, easy to break open rock, and you can get some nice fossils. It amazes me though, having been up here and done some scratching around, that these people have got beanies on. It's like, whoa. Anyway, this guy up the back here looking into the pond, possibly fishing. He's just given up. There's no pterosaurs to be found. Anyway, so that's the site where Tabonaga was found in, okay? So each year, Kronosaurus Corner, which is the museum that's located in Richmond, each year in around June, they have what's called the Big Dig, and this is a great example of citizen science where, you know, literally dozens of kind of volunteers and tourists and locals all get together under the supervision of the curators from Kronosaurus Corner, and they all have a big dig. And this is not technically this is not the day that Tabonaga was found. This is only a couple of years ago. And I believe they're digging out an ichthyosaur here, which is one of those marine reptiles. They're digging out that. But what you'll notice is that it takes a team to basically find a fossil. You've got all these people using little micro tools. This guy here's got the crowbar, trying to get the whole slab out. But basically, it's a team effort, and it's also incredibly hot work. So each of these, you've all heard of paleontologists and their toolkits. So let's just take you through a toolkit, okay? So every person should have one of these. Some little brushes going down, walkie-talkies, geological hammers, some chisels, some picks, knife and fork when you're eating. And you've got these tools here that are almost dentistry in nature. This is your typical paleontologist toolkit, okay? Typical. Unfortunately, or fortunately, Tabonaga was found with a slightly more sort of alternative toolkit. So I want to speak to you about lens discovery, which, as I said before, happened on June 2011. Now, Len's toolkit was a front-end loader. So I pointed out before the site, free fossil hunting site, and had that pond in the background. So Len, who is a local, he's been hunting fossils for 40-odd years up there, for a long, long time. He worked out that the most efficient way to find fossils was to grab his front-end loader, go down to free fossil hunting site, go straight to the big pond, and basically scoop up, you know, how many thousands of litres of water you can fit into that front-end loader. He'd then go over to a slightly slopey area and dump it, ever so delicately, but dump it on the ground. And what indeed would happen is it would quickly wash away the topsoil. Okay, so there was no need for this painstaking work with toothpicks, toothbrushes. You just dump the whole thing on. And what he sort of found in on this particular day was this. Can you see it? Right there. And that's what was staring back at him one day. And he realised straight away, well, this is a pretty important little find. So what he did was run over to the then curator, who was also at the dig site as well, a gentleman named Paul Stumkat, who was also one of the co-authors on the paper that we published. And he ran over to Paul and said, I think I found something pretty good. So Paul runs over and says, yep, I think you're right, Len. That looks... and Paul was immediately sort of said, this may be pterosaur. And in fact, he was right. So he sort of went, okay, stop, no more of the front end loader. We need to get more delicate here. So one step down, being delicate as they were, was the rock saw. So they got the rock saw out and then they proceeded to sort of cut around, and this is fairly normal, to be honest, for big fossils like that. They started to cut around, hoping that there was nothing where you're cutting because you're about to lose it. And they ended up with a slab that looked like that on the left-hand side. And then it was Paul's job, and this took him hundreds and hundreds of sort of hours of labour to basically prepare KKF 494 out of that slab of rock. And these are little stages that Paul's sort of given me photos from, and you can see that slowly and surely, the fossil is emerging out of, and I can't really sort of underplay the skill that is involved to go from that to that, okay? It takes science knowledge, it takes a technical skill, and also a little bit of artistry as well. So anyway, we went from that to that to that, and I know that's only 4 slides, but we're talking, you know, months and months of work to get to that stage. So now we're here. That's all well and good. Where do we go from here? Well, basically, it was prepared, it looked really, really nice. It was put on a shelf at Richmond with a little label that said Pterosauria indet, which simply means Pterosauria indeterminate. And it was sort of sat there for a while, and certain people had started to look at it and then stopped and started, stopped. But essentially, it stayed there for around about 5 years. And then I found out about it and thought, that'd make a great PhD project. So I got myself up to Richmond, and this is a photo that I took up at Richmond. This is Kronosaurus Corner, that museum that I was talking about. That's its namesake, a massive pliosaurid, Kronosaurus. And this is a neat little area. So inside the museum, we find a little pterosaur cupboard, okay? And they have all the bits that they've found over the years, nicely displayed with little labels and all that. You'll notice there's a gap missing here. Well, that's because that gap belonged to our guy, Tabonaga, and it was nicely prepared and sort of just kept in that cupboard. Now, you will notice, and I've got to make a little sort of, you know, I've got to be honest with you, that it's been, you'll see here that every time you've sort of seen a picture of it, it's in this orientation. That's because for years, most people who looked at this thought it was actually part of the upper jaw, okay? And it's really, really hard, and I also felt guilty to that as well for a while. For months, in fact, I was deciding, is it top jaw, is it bottom jaw? Eventually, there was enough features that we could work out that it actually was the bottom jaw. But that's why you'll notice a lot of these photos, it's orientated in that way. So basically, I went up to Kronosaurus Corner and essentially started taking a lot of photos. I took up my little light box. That's me holding the specimen very, very carefully. You can see how thin it is compared to my hands, especially down towards the posterior end of the lower jaw here. And I started to take anything that could be measured, I'd measure, and then I decided to take a lot of photos. And when I say a lot, just of this specimen alone, I looked through my sort of files, there was 403 photos just of this specimen. It's too much? I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, so that's how many photos I took. But essentially, that's what I needed to do. I also obviously looked at all the other stuff while I was there, but this talk's about Tabonaga, so I'll concentrate on that. And then I sort of had all that sort of data, and then came back to Brisbane. And essentially, we started to read the literature and to compare it against everything that we'd known, not just Australian material, but everything we knew worldwide. And to cut a long story short, and I'm skipping about 13 months now of research, we came to the conclusion that it had certain features that were very unique, and these are what we call Apomorphis, okay? So I'll go through them. Now, obviously remember, I've at this stage probably read, I don't know, in the order of 500, 600, 700 sort of pterosaur papers, just to make sure that I've covered all my bases. Make sure you compare it with everything that's similar, not so similar. Now, some of the pterosaurs that we know from around the world, it's quite easy to sort of, get rid of them. It doesn't belong in that. And simply because of the presence of teeth. So anything that didn't have teeth, it probably doesn't belong in that clade. So some of the process is quite quick, but then you get down to the nitty-gritty, and nitty-gritty it is. So I just want to highlight some of the unique features. So these are obviously features that have never been seen before in any pterosaur worldwide. The first one I want to point out is that, and it's a shocking orientation of a photo, but on top of the sort of the dorsal surface of the lower jaw here, remember how I showed you that groove that Aussie Draco had before? And that groove probably held nerves or blood vessels, something like that, we don't know for sure. This guy lacks any mandibular groove whatsoever, okay? The other weird thing about it was the fact that from around here to here, you'll see that all the alveoli or the tooth sockets are positioned laterally on the side of the jaw. So this means the teeth were coming out that way from the lower jaw. Very, very weird and gnarly, fearsome, all those things. The other thing that was extremely weird was the fact that the distance between these two alveoli was about half the distance of this one. And that's another weird thing that doesn't appear in any other pterosaur worldwide. And of course, the last one I've got here is that the third and the sixth alveoli are around about the same size. Again, never seen before. So they're the unique features. That's when we're kind of on the sort of the thing of the thinking of, oh, perhaps this is something brand new. But then you combine that with the fact that it has these combinations of features which have been seen before, but never in the same combination, okay? And some of those are the fact that you'll notice that the anterior or the front end of the mandible here slightly deflects, going upwards. The fact that the front edge of the mandibular crest here is slightly concave, okay? Just the sheer thinness of the crest down on the bottom edge. You'll notice here too that the increase, this is the front, okay? But you'll notice that the thickness increases gradually. Now, a lot of sort of closely related pterosaurs around the world that we thought this might have been sort of initially, a lot of them have this sort of real big, exaggerated, spoon-shaped kind of bill going on here. So they had what we call this kind of a fish grab or a big basket, okay, which this guy didn't have at all. And you will also notice, so looking at it sort of coming from dorsally here, is that you'll notice that the alveoli collars, these big, robust, sort of bony collars, are really, really prominently sticking out of the jaw. Again, this feature had been seen, but the entire collection of these features, I've left out one here, you'll notice that the crest begins pretty much right at the start of the lower jaw here. So the entire combination of these features was also never seen before in any pterosaur worldwide. So that obviously led us to the fact that this was something new. Just on the dentition, or the size of the teeth, the reason I banged on about the third and the sixth being sub-equal in size, a lot of the time, because the skull of pterosaurs are probably the most well-preserved things, thankfully, because they're also the most diagnostic, what you'll notice is that I did a little graph here of just basically you've got the alveoli number going underneath here. Forget about the log transform thing. That's essentially just so we don't have big jumps in numbers like that, because we really just want to focus on the change between, alveoli 1, alveoli 2, 3, and so forth. So we just really want to concentrate on the gradient of these lines here, hence the log transformed. So initially, everyone thought, not just me, but when this thing was first discovered, everyone thought, oh, we've found a species of Anaguera, which are these guys over here in the blue line and the purple line, okay? Now, unfortunately, Anaguera, though, is diagnosed by one feature, or more, but this is one of their big ones. Basically, in every species that belongs to the genus Anaguera, the 5th and the 6th alveolus are smaller than the 4th and the 7th, as highlighted by this circle here. Now, what you'll notice is that Tabonaga, which is the hashed line here, doesn't do that, okay? So that's pretty much a great way of sort of ruling out that Tabonaga belonged to Anaguera. The other thing that people thought, and myself included for a while, is that, okay, this thing looks a lot like another South American species called Tropignathus, this one here. And again, what you'll notice is that Tropignathus, the alveoli size increase, they get to the third one, and then it remains fairly constant through this little region here. Again, completely dissimilar to Tabonaga. So that was just another piece of evidence to sort of write off the fact that what people thought were the most closely related pterosaurs to what we had, actually, when it comes down to it, the little measurements, we can see that it didn't belong in either of those two genera at all. So, now, we now know that we have a new pterosaur species. And then we decided, okay, what were we going to call it? As I mentioned at the start in the acknowledgement to country, this fossil was found on the Wonomara country, and we thought, well, let's sort of a little nod to that language group. We started looking around in old sort of lexicons, dictionaries, and finding as much as we could about the Wonomara language. And we found a couple of really cool words. The first one was taboon, and that essentially meant spear. The next one was naga, which meant mouth. So there's your generic name, Tabonaga, okay, which essentially just means spear mouth, which is in reference to how thin and obviously deadly this lower jaw would have been. So the species name, though, was a no-brainer, and we decided to instantly call it shawi, and that, of course, honours Len Shaw and his front-end loader. And so what it means, as I said before, it just means Shaw's spear mouth, and that's how we got the name for Tabonaga shawi. Okay, so you now have an animal. That's all well and good, okay? But remember that a fossil, a hunk of rock, is just a hunk of rock unless we can actually put it into context. Give it some sort of skin and bones, as it were. Tell us a little bit more about the animal. It's all well and good just to measure something, to name it because you realise that we've never seen this before. But a paleontologist's job, arguably, is to actually put skin and bones on these animals and ask some sort of bigger questions. How did they live? What did it look like? What did it eat? Things like that. So the first thing we decided to do was try and find out, oh, okay, we've only got the lower jaw of this specimen. How do we know how big its wingspan was? So I must preface everything I'm about to say with saying that, of course, when you only have the anterior portion of a bottom jaw, any kind of estimation you want to make about wingspan has to remain, necessarily speculative, okay? But we can get a fairly good indication about how big this thing actually was when we sort of compare a near complete element, in this case, the Mandibular Symphysis, which is this region here, and I thought I'd just add that. So this is a complete, not Tabonaga, obviously, but this is another lower jaw, complete lower jaw of another pterosaur, and I just wanted to point out that that region there is what we call the Mandibular Symphysis, okay? So we have pretty much an almost complete element there in the Tabonaga that we described, okay? So what we did then is we thought, okay, let's grab some closely related pterosaurs that do also have a complete mandibular symphysis, and they also have known wingspans because we've got complete sort of skeletons or near complete skeletons. And we started doing that. And just as one particular example, this is Anaguera Episcopal from South America again, lived around the same kind of age as what Tabonaga did, around 104 million years ago. But fortunately, this guy is really well preserved, and we almost have a complete skeleton of it. So what we did is we sort of measured the mandibular symphysis of that. We also knew the wingspan of Anaguera, and essentially you're just scaling accordingly, okay? And what we came up with was the fact that our guy would have had a wingspan somewhere in the order of about 6.5 to 7 metres wide, okay? And to put that into context, a wedgie has a wingspan of about 2.5 metres, and a hang glider has a wingspan of around 10 metres. So as you can probably see here, this thing would have ruled the skies, okay? Oh, until we find another fossil that's bigger. It pretty much would have ruled the skies, and it would have been quite a sort of fearsome sight flying above the Toollabuk. So, next question we have to ask is, well, where does it fit in the big sort of family tree of pterosaurs? And what we find is, if we have a look down here, it fell in this little sort of neat sort of clade down here with our other two Australian pterosaurs, Mythunga and Pharaoh Draco. Pharaoh Draco obviously is in much younger rocks, but it falls in nicely with Mythunga and Tabonaga. So then you can ask yourself the question, well, what does that mean? What's that actually saying? And one of the questions we asked was, does that mean at some point there was some kind of endemic radiation of Australian pterosaurs? Perhaps. We don't really know, to be honest, but it's an intriguing little sort of hypothesis. So essentially what we're saying is that maybe somewhere earlier in time, some ancestral pterosaur flew into Australia and slowly diverged and became the different pterosaur species that we know today, okay? Because they are, if you look at them morphologically or their physical characteristics, they are very, very similar, with just some subtle subtle character changes here and there. So that's what we're able to glean from relationships. Okay, but now we want to talk about, okay, so where did this thing live? Okay, where did it call home? What did home look like? Well, Queensland 104 million years ago looked radically different than what it did today. You'll notice that these kind of bits of the browny, greeny bits, you'll see the map of Australia here. That's all land. This is Antarctica. It just hasn't cleaved off Australia completely yet. And you'll notice, though, that they had this shallow sea that covered approximately sort of 2/3 of Queensland back in that time. So basically, there's the fossil site, and that sea was called the Eromanga Sea, which is ironic because the township of Eromanga now is the town that's furthest away from the sea in any kind of given direction in Australia. But back in the day, it was smack bang in the middle of a shallow sea. Anyway, so that's where it would have been living. Now, if we know then that basically it was flying over this sort of vast inland sea, the next question we want to ask is, okay, well, what did it eat? One look at this thing and you can tell that this thing probably wasn't a vegan, okay? So, broccoli, I don't think so. And look, you really have to be careful about what you say sometimes when you're talking to the press. When this paper came out, I was sort of being asked, so what do you think it ate? And I was giving, well, it lived over the Eromanga Sea, so, possibly this, possibly that. And the journalist kept saying, well, how do you know? How do you know? And I was saying, well, look, if you look at the way it's built, it probably wasn't built to eat broccoli. And unfortunately, that became the title. So just be careful about what you say. So we think, okay, vegetables are off the menu. So what did it eat? Perhaps, I know that is obviously tongue-in-cheek, but if you have a look at the Paleo Pyramid, you will notice that here, it probably did tick that part of the list, and you could probably also include eggs in that as well. So it was living over the Eromanga, as I've said before, this vast inland sea, and we know from other fossils that have been found from the Eromanga that the diversity of life in the Eromanga was enormous. So it would have had its own smorgasbord of sort of seafood delicacies. Perhaps starting with a shellfish sort of entree, moving on to, I don't know, a fish dish, turtle soup, and then some of the various sort of marine tetrapods and dinosaurs that we also get from the Toowoomba Formation, which is obviously the same time. Obviously, these big things here, it would have had to been a juvenile in order for Tabonaga to eat this, but nevertheless, it possibly may have had a little pick at the kids. Anyway, so that would have been most likely a list of what it had to choose from in order to eat. So that is pretty much wraps up what I wanted to say tonight. So anyway, I just wanted to point out the fact that this was a reconstruction that was sort of recreated, done in order for the paper, for the release of the paper. And again, you can't get away with anything. So I've had emails from various people pointing out that the feet look ridiculous and they're far too small, pointing out that how do you know what the colour here would have been, how do you know it had little fuzzy sort of pycnofibres along here, when all you have essentially is this. And look, they're fair comments. We really don't know if the feet looked this warped. We don't know, what colour it was. But the only thing we do know is that we just need to keep going out to the Eromanga, to the Toowoomba Formation, and all these other wonderful formations around Australia, and keep digging. Because unless we do that, we'll never be able to answer any of these questions at all. So look, exam time. It was promised. First question, pterosaurs are dinosaurs with wings, true or false? Thank you. Second question, all pterosaurs are pterodactyls, true or false? Correct. Lovely. Anyway, you can't do this. Sort of good science is never, it's a team effort. It's not me. I want to thank all these people, particularly my co-authors, all my colleagues at the Dinosaur Lab, all the museums that I've sort of had the opportunity to sort of go and have a look at all this fantastic stuff. Dom and Emma and the whole team here at BrisScience, thank you very much for making me welcome. Joel, thank you. Obviously, and also my family for putting up with yet another pterosaur talk. And also, obviously, a bit of funding that goes in. This stuff is not cheap. Travelling around our big, broad country is not cheap. So I'd like to also thank those funding organisations there. And that is the talk. Thank you for coming.
Wow, Tim, what a way to kick off our in-person BrisScience again. That was brilliant, and I'm glad everyone passed the exam. Otherwise, we would have locked the doors and you had spent another hour training again. All right, so we've already had a whole bunch of questions come through. If you have more questions for Tim, put them into that link now, and we will get through as many of those as we can. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Our next and final talk for the year is the 6th of December, right here at the Edge. So if you're not already on our mailing list or on Twitter or one of the many socials, then make sure you follow us there so you can be notified when those tickets become available. We will then, of course, be back in the new year, so keep watching this space. All right. Tim, are you ready for some questions?
Yeah, far away.
All right. Let's start with the easy one. How do you go about constructing a skeleton and anatomy from such small fragments?
Well, that's what I sort of referred to at the end. It's a great question. Look, it's all, there's a certain amount of speculation that goes into, look, you need to assume that the specific animal you're referring to isn't some sort of freak in the way it grows. And if it follows the rules of how every other pterosaur grew, however, and all that sort of stuff that goes with it, then you can kind of get an idea of what this thing would have looked at. Now, yes, as I said, the colours, no idea, there are other fossils, not pterosaurs, unfortunately, but some dinosaur fossils where we're finding some chromatid sort of little cells, and you can get an idea of maybe what their feathers were and all that kind of stuff, the colour of their feathers and stuff. With pterosaurs, not so much. So it is a bit speculative, but look, in the paper, which is the most important thing at the end of the day, we did simply just a reconstruction of the skull, which I showed at one point. And that's all we did. That's all we felt comfortable really doing in terms of a reconstruction. As soon as the media get a hold of it, though, they want big, glossy colour pics. And I sort of, and you know, I'll admit I gave the okay to that image, the colourful one, because it would have looked something like that. Unless it was some sort of freak and all of a sudden they have 6 wings, you know, so. But you look, it's very hard. You can only really describe what you have, and the rest of it is purely speculation.
Great stuff, and thank you to Scott for that question. All right, Carl has a question. How breakable is a thin fossil like that? I'm assuming he was talking about the jawbone where you were holding it.
Breakable?
How breakable?
Extremely. So look, they trusted me to handle it. Obviously, the general public, if you do go up to Richmond to have a look, and it's still on display up in Richmond, you won't unfortunately be able to touch it because, as I sort of pointed out, a few of those, it's already very, very delicate, and even when I was handling it, you know, little bits of dust and rocks sort of start to come off, and you're like, oh, you know. So especially now that it's a holotype, if essentially that just means that it's now a specimen that a whole species, a whole animal has been erected on. Yeah, I don't think the public will get their hands on it anytime soon. Yeah, it's not a frisbee. So.
Okay, let's jump around. Okay, I'm going to change tack a little bit. Rose asks, and here we go. I heard you were an actor before. What made you change into the science field?
Thank you, Rose. Yes, look, yep, okay, just in a really brief nutshell, because this is not what the talk's about. I went, when I left school, I went through NIDA, did the acting course down there in Sydney, and proceeded to sort of, you know, trample on the board, so to speak, for 15 years. But look, and I've said this before to sort of other media outlets, there was a stage in your life when you think, I want to do something else, and that's the best answer I can kind of give. And I thought, and look, this is obviously with the support of my loving family as well. It's not sort of easy to give up a job and go back and retrain yourself in something. But I just had to look at my cupboard, and this is God's honest truth. I looked at my bookshelves one day and went, well, it's all play scripts and movie scripts or dinosaur books. And I thought, well, I want to be a paleontologist. And I said that I went into this so naively, thinking, I'll just do a bachelor and yeah, I'll be a paleontologist. And yeah, so 10 years later, here I am, and still not really, you know, a paleontologist. I don't really consider myself a paleontologist, not just yet. You know, it's still learning. We're still, you know, students. So, but that's how I got there. So yeah, it was a weird sort of 180 change, but not really. In some respects, it was something I'd always kind of enjoyed learning about, reading about. It was never a chore, and I like to use the other side of my brain. So.
And I think we all benefit from your amazing presentation skills.
Oh.
Okay, apparently there is a lot of interest in Pterosaur Jaw Strength. Matt and Chris, amongst others, want to know, do we know anything about the Pterosaur bite forces?
Yeah, we do. It's unfortunately not with the Australian material. We haven't done any research on that. But in other sort of nations, other research labs have certainly done what's called finite element analysis, which is basically just applying loads and stresses to bones and modelling them in 3D, sort of really fancy computer images, and being able to sort of play around with all those properties. I can't give you accurately the kind of the bite force in newtons, but certainly it would have been enough, you know, for something like this, would have been enough to sort of grab a very slippery fish and be able to lift it out of the water, that's for sure. I don't know the exact sort of bite force, but yeah, there's been work done on it.
Okay, questions here. Sorry, I got distracted by all these, there's a lot of questions coming through here. So I'm just going to, I'll ask this quick one from Andrew, and I'm not sure which Andrew it could be, but it might be in the front row. Have you ever considered changing your name to Tim, spelled P-T-I-M?
Yeah, originally, yeah, my Twitter handle was Pterosaur Tim.
Very nice. Question here, why is it that a majority of pterosaurs only have skulls or dental fossils preserved?
Great question. Again, that comes down to the fact that most fossils, most of the limb bones were probably adapted, not probably, they were adapted to flight, hence they're very, very fragile. And whereas the skull, it not only, yes, it obviously was part of the flying animal as well, but it also needed to do other things like bite, hold, you know, all those kind of things. So there's a sort of a payoff there that's needed, and because of that, the skulls tend to be a little bit more robust. And anything that's more robust in terms of skeletal material will have a better chance at sort of fossilising and preserving and all that.
Okay. You got enough for just a couple more questions?
Yeah.
All right, great. Sarah asks, with such giant heads or snouts, how are they not front heavy when they fly?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, look, quite often, rightly or wrongly, pterosaurs are described with just a pair of wings with a head bolted on. And it does seem odd, their shape. But look, I am obviously not part of any of this research, but there has been a lot of research done in terms of the aerodynamics of pterosaur flight. And it appears that, you know, and I'm really sort of simplifying this, but it would appear that the bigger the head, the more sort of adapted it was to soaring flight, which still involves flapping and powered flight and things like that. But once you're up, and this also comes also to the shape of the wing and the high sort of wing aspect ratio of pterosaurs as well. But yeah, look, no, they definitely flew. They were just light enough to do it. So the biggest pterosaur, and I didn't put this into the talk, perhaps this is next year's talk, Dom, but the biggest pterosaur that lived was Quetzalcoatlus, and that thing had a wingspan, not related to our guys whatsoever, but that thing had a wingspan of somewhere in the order of about 12 metres. So it's a light aeroplane, essentially. And look, there's been a lot of debate and a lot of research done on not just how it flew, but how did this thing take off, you know? So yeah, that research is fascinating, but it's not something I've kind of delved into yet, so.
All right, and the last couple of questions.
Yep.
Let's get to the existential ones now.
Yeah.
The fossils look very hard to spot. Does it trouble you knowing you may have missed some? And that might be a leading question. Maybe you don't.
Yeah. Look. I'll be honest with you, and I sort of made it light of the situation about the front end loader and blah blah blah. But yeah, I can't help but wonder if they'd sort of attacked it with something less sort of drastic. How much more of that animal, you know, possibly. Look, I'm grateful that they found anything at all, but you can't help but wonder, you know, what else may have been there. But yeah.
Great point. And maybe that leads to a final question. Rebecca asks, if you were given an unlimited budget, which one place would you most like to set up a dig site?
Not related to pterosaurs whatsoever, but I'd really like to go to Antarctica. And set up a dig site there. I think there's a whole world of diversity down there that we haven't quite, we're only just scratching the surface on. There are fossils down there, there are pterosaurs down there, obviously dinosaurs, and I'd really like, I just want to go to Antarctica and hang out there for a while. So that's if I had unlimited budget, I think that's where I'd go. Next stop, if it was purely pterosaur related, would be just north of Brazil, so for the party and for the science. So, yeah, they pull out some really amazing things there, and also China. China now, the fossils they're finding in China, dinosaurs, pterosaurs, you name it, the detail in some of these fossils are just mind-boggling. So, you know, you've got soft tissue preservation, you've got feathers, and it's just whoa. You know, it's almost like a little CT scan in a rock. It's just beautiful. So unfortunately, the Australian climate has not held up, and you know, it's done some horrible things to our fossils, but over the millions of years. But you know, that's the nature of the beast.
Great. Well, thank you for taking us on that whirlwind tour of everything from pterosaurs to fossil finding to indeed this latest discovery.
Thank you.
And I encourage everybody to head to Kronosaurus Corner and check it out. I've been there, fantastic place. Yeah. And we can't wait for your next talk and maybe the next big discovery, Tim.
Yeah. Well,
and good luck with the rest of the project.
Thank you very much.
Everyone, please join me in thanking our speaker tonight, Tim Richards.
Thank you.
Thank you. And unfortunately, no food and drink tonight, but please come back and join us next month. And if you could pop your masks on as you're making your way out, that'd be fantastic. And we'll see you all soon. Have a great night.